Well, it's a Saturday morning and I'm in the workshop, which is not my ideal, but at least it's to work on my own bike. The number 40 bike on the bench there, this is my race GSXR 400. I did it in a sort of Sieto replica of the Japanese endurance race series from the 90s. Needs fork seals doing, so front end's out, fork seals, last fork leg here, just taking a break while I let the oil settle in this leg, and then I can just set the oil level. We do that with this dipstick. Basically the oil's in that tube now, in the fork. That's set at the right level, at the height we want the oil at, so we drop that into there, and then two-handed, you pull on this syringe, it draws the oil out of the tube and make sure that you've got the oil exactly the right height in there, whatever you want it at. On these I think we've got it set at 95 mil. So that's today's job. I'm going to do the fluids, petrol change on it, and just a general setup. I'm at a track day on Saturday next week to do a lot of testing. GSXR and my TZR 250 will go to that. And then we're racing at Croft first weekend of April. So I've got 2 or 3 weeks then, hopefully, to sort out any issues or have a look at anything that needs looking at. We ended the week off this week, finishing off with this CB 750 engine. It's just had 4 rebores. It came into us blowing oil, and when we took it apart it had new pistons. The engine's had a recent rebuild, you can see it's really clean and tidy, but it was still on its original bores, so the new pistons and rings just hadn't settled in, and they was just started to blow oil, which they often do, I think, when you try and put really old tired bores into use again. So we've bored all these out to 0.5 mil oversize. Then we were going to put the cylinder head on and rebuild up, but we found an issue. This head has at some point been skimmed, which is no real problem. It's only had a little flash off, but these little spacer tubes here fit into these, and when they're in, they have to be an exact height there off the cylinder head. Now this one is one of the shorter ones, so it's probably just about right, but it had a couple of longer ones of these in. The problem is they were protruding so far that they were sticking up too high, and it meant that they were hitting the cylinder head. Now we spotted this before we refitted it, but I can see in the past where one of them's done that. Once we sort of worked it out, I had a look at this and thought, hang on a sec, and yeah, one's been touching there. So they would have held the cylinder head up slightly off the gasket. The gasket is supposed to sit between those two faces and crush down nicely. There's also some sealing tubes that go into these as well, and they have to crush down. So it's all got to be done to exact tolerances that Honda designed, and once you skim a bit off the head, you then have to reduce all the other parts to match. So we're going to have to get into that at the start of next week. I'll machine all these down. Had to buy a couple of new ones. The 1 or 2 that were too long, I thought, well, we'll just get replacements from Honda. They're 15 mil long standard, I believe, if I remember my ordering, and we're probably going to reduce them down to 12 mil somewhere on there just to make sure that they have clearance. That'll go back together, and then it'll go back into this chassis, which is already on the bench waiting for it. And that'll be the start of next week's work, I think. We've got an XLXR engine over there, sorry, XLX250R engine on the bench there. Bit of a long-term engine repair, this one. It came in partially dismantled. We opened it up, we found lots and lots of problems inside it. The owner had bought the bike, was hopeful it was slightly better than it was. When we got it apart, we found a lot of issues. So bit by bit, we're just trying bits, making sure bits are going to work. He's had the engine away, had it blasted and repainted. It looks really tidy. We've got new main bearings fitted into it already, just to make sure that they're all right, and we're just going through it part by part. We found a bent valve. It doesn't actually look bent visibly, but when we took this engine apart, all the rockers were massively worn away. One of them had pretty much snapped, and that valve has probably just touched a piston at some point in its last few minutes of running. So when we tried to grind it, we just had a point on the valve seat that didn't grind, and when you put it in the lathe and check it, it's got a fraction of a bend in it. So luckily you can still get the valves for these. So I've got 1 new valve on order. The other 3 were absolutely fine. They've gone in and ground up nicely. So a bit of an issue with engines, getting on with them and then finding problems. We had an RS125 motor we were going to rebuild. I'll do a little photo on that later, but we came to rebuilding it, looked at one of the cases and thought, a bit on that bearing housing doesn't look quite right, and yet it had been previously sort of snapped away and put back together like that. So we take it apart and then we find it as we rebuild it. But anyway, that's gone off to Barry at Blue Haze. He's doing probably an engineering repair with a welding a new flange on. I'll go into that at a later date because it's a little bit of a complicated one. But that's me Saturday. Going to get these fork legs back in, get this GSX-R 400 back together, bring my TZR 250 in, and do a load of fluids and setup changes on that. But good old reliable TZR, it'll fire up and it'll work quite happily. And then yeah, all prepped up for a week ahead of work and a weekend of playing at Cadwell.